Thank you, Peter, for the kind introduction, and to Trinity for the invitation. It's sort of a cliche to say that an invitation to deliver a lecture series such as the Birkbeck lectures is humbling. In this case, it really is. Previous Birkbeck lectures include precisely those authors that inspired me to become a historian, and in particular to become a historian of religion and society when I was an undergraduate at the University of Colorado. So to be invited to this series is, I think, the greatest honor of my career so far. And the work I'll be presenting in many ways is the culmination of research that the Junior Research Fellowship I held here at Trinity allowed me to embark on. I was able to enter into new domains, take risks into totally new areas. That's finally coming together in the book project that I'm going to outline for you over the next 4 lectures. Let me warn you, I'm going to speak a little bit longer today than I will in the future lectures, front-loading a little bit of background material, and those next lectures will leave more time for Q&A than I'll be able to do today. A previously unknown people emerged in 224 CE. They did so in conjunction with the formation of a new imperial regime. An upstart ruler in the region of Fars, or Persia, Ardashir, defeated the Parthian king of kings, whom you see here, or maybe not quite here. Here we go. No, there's one missing here. Okay, sorry, I'm actually missing a slide, my apologies. Defeats the Parthian king of kings and comes to definitively displace a dynasty that had dominated the Middle East for upward of 4 centuries, bringing an end to both the Parthian and Hellenistic political traditions that had dominated from the conquests of Alexander. And he inherits its territories from the deserts of Arabia to the highlands of Afghanistan. Surprisingly, the regime Ardashir inaugurated would not carry the name of the regional kingdom over which he had presided, namely Persia. In coins minted immediately after his establishment of imperial supremacy, the court endowed the king with an unprecedented title, Shah Iran, or King of Kings of the Iranians. This was the first time in the Middle Eastern political tradition that an imperial ruler made the claim to rule in the name of a single people. The naming of the state represented, at the very least, a definitive break with Hellenistic and Parthian political cultures. To communicate the name of the regime and the event of political rupture, the court of Ardashir minted coins of remarkable uniformity and remarkable purity across the disparate territories of the formerly Parthian Empire. From the Euphrates to the Merv Oasis, the bust of Ardashir with an exclusively Middle Persian title replaced regional royal coinages and their Greek, Parthian, and Aramaic inscriptions. Ironically, the court adapted the quintessentially Hellenistic communicative technology of coinage to declare the end of the Partho-Hellenistic era. Each of these coins announced the arrival of an empire of the Iranians, what subsequent inscriptions would call Iran Shah, literally the territory of the Iranians. Who were these Iranians, these Iran? Where did they come from? The obvious question has gone without a historical answer, and it's the goal of these lectures to provide such an answer and to account for the success of an ethnic discourse as the most effective framing for an imperial project in the pre-modern Middle East, if we measure efficacy in terms of the endurance of a regime. For the empire Ardashir inaugurated endured for 4 centuries, until the beginning of its collapse at the hands of the early Muslim conquerors in 636 CE, with a political stability that other contemporary regimes would have regarded as enviable. Indeed, the legacy of so successful an imperial project would continue to animate political aspirations and institutional developments well into the Middle Ages and beyond, in the Middle East, Central Asia, and even South Asia. The Iranian tradition would play a role in post-Iranian political cultures, similar to that of the Roman legacy in Europe. And yet, the Iranian Empire figures marginally, so marginally in the historiography of the pre-modern world as to merit a mention almost exclusively in terms of its military encounters with Rome. Not even its name elicits recognition. If familiar at all, the empire is known as Sasanian, Persian, or more recently, Neo-Persian. I can think of no other state or political culture represented in modern historical writing entirely in terms of the discourse of contemporary others, namely the Romans, or still worse, in terms that modern historians have invented wholesale. The Achaemenid Persian Empire, by contrast, figures prominently in contemporary historiography and in contemporary culture, despite its comparative lack of chronological endurance or of an enduring legacy. The storehouse of knowledge of the Persian Empire resided among the Greek historiographers, not among the Aramaic, Persian, or Akkadian writing communities, who appear famously to have forgotten the Persians within a century or so of the empire's collapse. Modern historians cannot resist the temptation of associating the Iranian Empire with its purportedly Persian predecessor on account of the prestige Persia continues to elicit among a Western thinking class still generally acquainted with the writings of Herodotus and Thucydides, although, let's be honest, I think most of my generation haven't actually read them. The question of the naming of the empire, I aim to demonstrate today, is not a matter of pedantry. It gets to the heart of the historical significance of the First Empire to define its political project, not only in ethnic, but also in religious terms. It opens new terrain for exploring the relationship between religion, ethnicity, and empire, a basic concern for historians of the first millennium CE in West Asia more generally. The starting point for posing this question, who are the Iranians, is an answer from a philological, if not from a historical perspective. In a foundational work from the 1980s, Gerardo Gnoli provided an unsurpassed account of what the Iranians were not. They were not a pre-existing ethnic group, community, or a people emerging from the highlands of Persia to forge an empire. Comprehensively assessing the various manifestations of the term Arya across ancient Iranian languages of the first millennium, from the early first millennium BCE to the 3rd century CE, he located no traces of an actually existing population bearing the ethnonym Iran before the inscriptions produced in the 220s CE. It was an ancestral lineage of the Achaemenid dynasty in the 5th century BCE, but primarily the term appears in the Avesta, the orally transmitted compilation of myths and liturgies evolving within the Zoroastrian tradition, and only put down in writing under Iranian rule in the 6th century CE, and surviving in medieval and early modern manuscripts, such as this example in the British Museum. The Iranians, in other words, were a purely mythical people. They were the kings and warriors who were believed to have supported the religion of Zoroaster, again, according to this mythical tradition of the Avesta. The court of Ardashir's deployment of the term evoked a mythical people widely known among the recently conquered communities of the Parthian era. For however little is known of Parthian Zoroastrianism, the evidence makes plain the widespread practice of Zoroastrian liturgies that included the recitation of these Avestan myths across Parthian territories. An Iranian people thus pre-existed the 3rd century empire only in the tales of Zoroastrian priest scholars, storytellers, and in the minds of their auditors. What then did the court intend in defining its political community in terms of Zoroastrian myth? For audiences unfamiliar with the Zoroastrian mythical identities of the Iran, the Royal Mint repurposed an image drawn from earlier regional coinage from the region of Persia to assign the Zoroastrian religion a foundational role in Ardashir's political project. Each coin portrayed a fire altar, a shrine at which Zoroastrian priests performed their fundamental ritual, the yasna. Such images would form the standard reverse of Iranian coinage until the end of the empire and beyond, with only a handful of exceptions that equally emphasized the interdependency of the Iranian regime and its religion. At the very outset of Iranian rule, the coinage represented an image of a political theoretical claim embodied in a metaphor that would have a long afterlife in the Middle East. Religion and rulership are twins, according to the letter of Tansar. Iranian elites claimed that religion and the empire had been born together as twins. They were surprisingly not wrong. The phenomenon that the modern scholarly construct of Zoroastrianism encompasses were scarcely new in the 3rd century. The Yasna liturgy that I've mentioned anteceded in its fundamentals the Achaemenid Persian regime, even if its evolution would continue into the Iranian era and beyond. And the hotly contested archaeology of the earliest fire temples certainly demonstrates pretty unambiguously, the distribution of such rituals across Parthian territories, if not within the earlier Persian regime. Nevertheless, Zoroastrianism was born as a religion in the 3rd century in conjunction with the consolidation of the Iranian regime in the stricter analytical sense of the term religion. The modern scholarly term designates communities of doctrine self-consciously exclusive, defined in opposition to other religions, with boundaries and gatekeepers. And lively debates concerning the appropriateness of the analytical framework for the ancient world have identified extensive distortions that a term grounded in modern monotheist thinking has introduced. What's only beginning to attract interest is a sea change in the ancient understanding and representation of doctrines and practices concerning the human relationship with the metahuman in late antiquity. The Christian definition of exclusive religious communities, in contrast with others, such as polytheists or Jews, comes to approximate the semantic range of the modern scholarly term religion, even if no single word emerged in late antiquity, at least in Christian late Roman communities, to designate different religions comparatively as homologous phenomena. The exception is really in Syriac in the 6th century. We start to see a phrase, importantly in Syriac within the Iranian world, a phrase emerging, it translates as fear of God, that does approximate that modern semantic range of the term religion. Such a concept of religion did emerge in the Iranian Empire, precisely in the milieu of the early court, defining its rule in terms of Zoroastrian myth and ritual. The first usage of a term cognate with the modern construct religion appears in the mid-3rd century writings of the prophet Mani in the self-same Middle Persian language that the court employed. Mani referred to the various religions known to him, Zoroastrianism, Judaism, Christianity, and Buddhism in particular, as what he called Dain, a term systematically designated bounded communities of doctrine and ritual, each with their own exclusive identities. Recent work of scholars of Manichaeism, especially Jason Badun, has documented the extent to which Mani rhetorically deployed the concept of Dain to define his religion in the strict sense as the only religion encompassing and transcending the truths of the other Dain. It's impossible to determine what religious thinker or leader first employed this Middle Persian term Dain in the 3rd century. Mani's writings survive to a much greater extent than any contemporary Zoroastrian writings do. Nevertheless, the term clearly comes from a Zoroastrian background, comes from the Avestan term Daena, and we find the term used in a manner quite similar to Mani's usage in contemporary 3rd century Zoroastrian inscriptions. For example, in the inscriptions of Kirdir, who is the most powerful Zoroastrian priest, scholar, or priest judge in the 3rd century, a figure to whom we will return in the 2nd lecture. To be Iran was necessarily to be Zoroastrian, to be a member of the Zoroastrian Dain. And across a wide variety of literary sources in a range of languages from late antiquity, the religious significance of the ethnonym is uniformly consistent. So we arrive at a simple answer to the question, who are the Iran in the 3rd century? They're Zoroastrians, or more accurately, those who self-consciously identified as members of an exclusive Zoroastrian religious community along the lines of this new concept of Dain emerging in the 3rd century. The discourse of religion in the 3rd century entails a break with pre-existing Hellenistic and Parthian practices of engagement with the metahuman. And those of you who are familiar with Hellenistic or the Parthian religious landscape will perhaps be aware, especially in studying the material culture, right, the term syncretism, deeply problematic, recurs sort of all over the place. It's almost, it sort of can't be put down. And yet it captures a profound truth. It's deeply unproblematic to combine deities from the Zoroastrian or Greek tradition with different names and so on. This is something that really comes to an end in the 3rd century with these much more clearly bounded divisions between different religions. The proliferation of the term Iranian as a descriptor of such self-consciously distinct and bounded Zoroastrians between the 3rd and 5th centuries attests to the widespread success of a vision of human societies as divided into discrete religious communities, parallel to contemporaneous, comparable, and much better charted developments in the late Roman world. What we witness at the court of Ardashir is the first documented harnessing of the power of religious identity and community to an imperial project. To title himself Shah Iran, put plainly, was to claim to rule in the name of the Zoroastrian community. The stability of the empire, I'll argue across these 4 lectures, resided in the evolution of this Iranian identity and its institutions. The definition of Iranian as Zoroastrian is nevertheless insufficient, as the terms, even though the terms become largely synonymous in the literature after the 3rd century. If Iranian was de facto Zoroastrian, the reverse was not the case. It's unlikely, to say the least, that the Zoroastrians of the empire in 224 CE conceived of themselves as Iranian, given the absence of the ethnonym in the Parthian era. Beyond the frontiers, robust communities of Zoroastrians continued to develop without reference to the Iranians, beyond their recitation in the mythical accounts of the Avesta among Sogdian and Bactrian Zoroastrian communities, which over the course of the centuries we're considering will become quite far-flung between China and Central Asia. It's difficult to say in the current state of the evidence whether the majority of adherents to Zoroastrian rites, would ever have defined themselves as Iranian. Every self-declaration of an Iranian identity occurs in an elite, specifically aristocratic context. The contrast with the Christian identity developing contemporaneously is revealing. The embrace of a self-conscious identity as Christian, commencing with the famous declarations of the early martyrdoms, across social classes and across ethnic and cultural distinctions, is characteristic of the transformation of late Roman society. Christian identities proved highly disruptive to Roman order, as they formed the basis, at least at times, for the mobilization of massive cross-class communities, frequently to the inconvenience of the Roman regime. Nothing of this kind takes place in the Iranian world, where the underclass, so to speak, is truly remarkable for its almost complete invisibility across all literary sources. It's here useful to define my use of terms and to distinguish the ethnic political community of the Iranians from more familiar national political communities. The specter of the nation-state continues to haunt a field that is called Iranian studies, whose practitioners take for granted the notion of a multi-millennial continuity from the Bronze Age or the early Iron Age into modernity. There is, to my knowledge, no other domain of pre-modern studies similarly dedicated to the demonstration of continuity. Even in East Asian or Chinese studies, questions of rupture and discontinuity predominate in the historiography, and the notion of a continually existing community of culture over millennia is hotly contested, to put things mildly. The continuity of a putatively Iranian people has been alternatively defined as racial, ethnic, or cultural over the course of the 20th century and 21st century, almost precisely conforming with the political cultural ideals of the West as they shift from racial, ethnic to cultural. As Reza Zia Ibrahimi documents in his book, sorry, this slides got a little confused here. I should have double-checked. Already toward the end of the 19th century, Qajar intellectuals and political elites began to embrace the racialized conception of an Aryan, that is, Iranian identity, as a vision for a national community privileged in the emerging race-based global hierarchy. A concoction of European philology and biological pseudoscience increasingly gained ascendancy in the interwar era, with support from one place in particular, Berlin, where the publication of a series of journals promoted an ancient historical archaeological foundation for a racially exclusive Iranian nationalism. Politically, and this is a movement in which the foundational historical work on the so-called Sasanian period was produced. So we have the Danish scholar Arthur Christensen, whose work is still the starting point for research, giving lectures in Tehran, propagating precisely this sort of racialized vision of national community grounded in an ancient historical account of the material that I'll be covering today and over the rest of these lectures. Politically, the movement culminated in the renaming of the state as Iran instead of Persia in international correspondence in 1934. And a recent archival discovery demonstrates that the impetus for this change came from the Persian diplomatic mission in Berlin. The nationalist vision of Iranian history remains so prominent within the field as almost to go unnoticed. And the most glaring example is the analytically slipshod way in which the terms Iranian and Persian are employed. It's the goal of my lectures not so much as to provide a critique, but to provide an alternative. To refer to the Iranian people of late antiquity as an ethnic, not a national community, is no mere matter of terminological politeness. The nation, to adopt the straightforward definition of Ernst Gellner, is a political project precipitating the vertical integration of communities across classes within a political territory, not simply politically, but also economically and culturally. The Iranian political project, by contrast, entails the horizontal integration of communities of elites across territories and reinforces their positions as socially, economically, and culturally dominant over the great bulk of the human population, laborers in various forms of dependency. In this respect, the Iranian Empire resembled all agrarian political regimes before the beginnings of industrialization. And although there are two recent works displayed here arguing for the pre-modern emergence of the nation in Song China and East Rome, respectively, the Iranian case exhibits none of the phenomena underpinning these still controversial arguments. A centralized pan-imperial education system integrating individuals across class boundaries, freeholding peasants as a significant portion of the population, or religions espousing an identity across classes. The analytical term ethnicity, our alternative, can involve either vertical or horizontal integration. And to take a definition from the most influential scholar of the phenomenon, the pre-modern, Walter Pohl, ethnicity entails a principle of organization of the social world into named groupings which are perceived as naturally constituted. This mutability of ethnicity does not detract from its salience. To again quote from Pohl, in a passage I think is particularly relevant to the study of Iran in late antiquity, ethnicity allowed translating the ever-changing allegiances to social groups of all size into a relatively time-resistant set of distinctions between collective actors. The case of the Iranians provides an example of the effectiveness of ethnicity as a mode of political organization in polities dependent on fractious aristocratic communities. Fractious aristocratic communities, I would add, that are also geographically disparate across a continental empire without the Mediterranean to facilitate rapid communication and mobility across its territories. The novelty of the Iranian identity, then, poses a problem. If there were no Iranians in 223 CE, how were persons and communities to come to redefine themselves after the establishment of the regime in 224 CE? The question here is similar to the classic problem of the historiography of nationalism. How did geographically, culturally, socially disparate groups come to identify with a single political project? And the classic answer to the question for the 19th century, I think, is relevant to the third. In Benedict Anderson's account of the rise of nations as imagined communities, technologies of communication, especially print media, and corresponding standardization of language made possible the dissemination of national subjectivities. Such a process was, generally speaking, impossible in overwhelmingly non-literate pre-modern agrarian societies. The emergence of an imagined community of shared origins was, however, possible within what Anderson called the tiny literate reefs on top of vast illiterate oceans. Among literate elites, or perhaps more accurately, elites with access to literary products and conscious of their contents, new media do communicate a standardization of language and a discourse of political identity in the course of the 3rd century construction of the regime, albeit media of a very different kind than the 19th century vehicles of nationalism. The first such new media I've already mentioned, that's this Iranian silver coinage, the drachm. Coinage, of course, is hardly new in the 3rd century, and yet the coins minted from 224 onward dramatically differed from previous Parthian or Hellenistic coinage. Regional diversity in terms of symbolism and language disappears completely in favor of a remarkable degree of uniformity, as I've already highlighted. They also display an entirely new script and language, a new form of Middle Persian epigraphy, the so-called Pahlavi script, which is notable for its crispness, for its clarity, and also its conformity across different media. So we see the same script appearing equally suddenly in contemporaneous documents, say from Do Europos, as well as in the epigraphy across a wide range of different materials. In stark contrast, I think you can notice this without even being able to pick a letter out of the script, you can compare the clarity here of this early Sasanian coinage, or early Iranian coinage, with late Parthian coinage, which is quite different. In fact, the inscriptions are so illegible that numismatists have a hard time determining which language they're written, in which language they're written. The standardized Pahlavi script for Middle Persian emerged gradually in the region of Persia in the 2 centuries or so prior to the establishment of the Iranian court, and after 224 became the standard form of governmental communication across the empire, with the exception of Bactria. The symbolic, linguistic, and ideological uniformity of the coinage served to reinforce the ideological content of the inscriptions, and the quality of the coinage underpins the ideological claims. The silver content of these finely minted coins, of course here I'm referring to the early Iranian coinage, averaged around 90% and rarely dropped below 85% across 4 centuries. The contrast with contemporary Roman coinage undergoing spiraling debasement is instructive, as is the irregularity of the quality of the Parthian coinage. Iranian drachms embodied the entwined political, cultural, and political economic innovations and incentives that the court offered to post-Parthian elite communities. And this entwining of the material and the immaterial constitutes a leitmotif of my lectures. To render loyalty to the Iranian kings of kings and to join the proposed community of Iranians was also to receive salaries and to participate in transactions in a currency of unprecedented stability in the context of the Iron Age Middle East or Central Asia. And this was the least of the privileges to which Iranian identity would guarantee access. And I'll be turning to those privileges, those very material privileges to which the Iranian identity gave access in the next 3 lectures. The communicative dimension of the coinage raises the question of audience and invites a return to the political landscape of the early 3rd century in which the Iranian identity was to gain traction. The Arsacid dynasty that had dominated the Middle East from the middle of the 2nd century BCE, through their orchestration of a set of aristocratic communities that, when operating in concert, could field the most powerful cavalry armies in West Asia under the command of powerful aristocratic figures such as this famous character surviving in bronze. The Parthian or Arsacid Empire inherited from the Seleucid kingdom a network of poleis, organized along Greek lines, and an aristocratic order, the Parthian aristocratic order constitutes a kind of superstructure overlaying existing political communities. The great Parthian houses, Suren, Karen, Mihran, possessed vast landholdings and tens of thousands of dependents, so-called bandag, typically lower-ranking aristocratic cavalrymen. With their own autonomous sources of economic and military power, they exercised a high degree of political autonomy and made and unmade Parthian kings of kings at their leisure. In the first 2 centuries CE, 2 political predicaments combined to weaken the position of the dynasty: increasing rebelliousness of Greek city-states and increasing Roman militarism, resulting in campaigns that resulted in the Roman conquest of Mesopotamian centers of royal power twice in the 2nd century. Although the evidence is so scant as to make all arguments inherently provisional, the late Parthian rulers appear to have turned toward Zoroastrian symbols and archaic titles at the expense of Hellenistic representations of their rule. For instance, we see the abandonment of Greek inscriptions in favor of Middle Iranian inscriptions, which are, as I say, largely illegible. It was thus in a context of ideological ambiguity that the court of Ardashir announced an unambiguous ideological program. Its aim was straightforward: reunify these great aristocratic houses and their dependents more cohesively and collaboratively around the imperial project. And it was helpful here that those myths of the Iran recounted not only kings supporting the religion of Zoroaster, but also their aristocratic allies. The Iranian identity encompassed both royal and aristocratic families in its original sort of Avestan mythical manifestation. The first Iranian rulers had, of course, defeated the Parthian kings of kings and their aristocratic allies, or king of kings and aristocratic. Well, actually, there is a little bit of ambiguity how many kings are ruling in 224 CE, but I'll leave that to the side. And they did so, of course, in episodes of violent subjugation that subsequent Parthian families would continue to recall. They did not forget their violent defeat at the hands of a new dynasty, and they did not forget the trauma of the transition to Iranian rule. Other Parthian families seem readily to have embraced this new regime and to have joined the armies of Ardashir and his successors with enthusiasm in, for example, the military campaigns against the Romans, to which I'll be turning in a moment. It was to these communities that the court directed its vision of a new political community unified in terms of the Iranian framework. It did so not only or even primarily through coinage. It organized large-scale collective rituals in order not simply to communicate the ideological and institutional program of the court, but to choreograph performances of Iranian community, bringing into being, making palpable an imagined community. Fortunately, amid the highly limited evidence of the 3rd century, we possess 2 transcripts for such rituals in the form of monumental inscriptions. And here I ask for the indulgence of those in the audience who have heard an earlier version of this argument that I presented in Cambridge several years ago, as it's really foundational to the subsequent 3 lectures of the series. The complexes of Naqsh Rustam and Paykuli contain the richest archives of, just hold on 1 second, sorry. My slides got a little moved around, I think, or maybe I sent the wrong version. The complexes of Naqsh Rustam and Paykuli contain the richest archives, textual, artistic, and archaeological, for the study of the early Iranian regime. On these towers, at the intersection of strategic routes across the empire, the early Iranian regime reintroduced an ancient technology of communication that had not been employed in the Middle East for upward of 5 centuries. The monumental multilingual inscription, of which you see several examples here from the Persian era and on the lower right hand from the Iranian era. The trilingual inscription of Shapur I in Middle Persian, Parthian, and Greek directly imitated Achaemenid Persian precedents, still visible on the tombs of Naqsh Rustam or on the ruined columns of Persepolis. These already ancient inscriptions were recognizable as trilingual even to those who could not read the cuneiform script, as apparently no one in the 3rd century could have. Just as in the 10th century, the early Muslim court of the Buyids could recognize the significance of Middle Persian inscriptions without the capacity to decipher them. So we have here an explicit imitation of an already ancient practice of the multilingual inscription. In these 3rd century inscriptions, the court insists on the primacy of Middle Persian, the original on which the Parthian and Greek versions were based. The Greek version, for example, includes Middle Persian terms such as nibist, which is what is written, when a Greek term is readily available. There are plenty of Greek terms that could be used for the inscription. Suggesting that even the Greek version is directed at a bilingual audience in favor of Middle Persian and Parthian. And by the end of the 3rd century, the Iranian court had brought an end to both the Aramaic and Greek epigraphic traditions through which the Hellenistic and Parthian rulers had communicated with their subjects in favor of an exclusively Middle Iranian discourse, or Middle Persian discourse. The privileging of the Middle Iranian languages over Greek and Aramaic also suggests a boundary between the top stratum of the aristocracy, the so-called Iranians, and sub-elites was defined linguistically. That is, to be Iranian in some sense entailed a facility with a Middle Iranian language, Persian or Parthian, Middle Persian or Parthian. And in the distinctive language of the Iranian discourse, these epigraphic monuments defined 2 discrete roles that bearers of the ethnonym were to fulfill. The first is the conduct of military campaigns, and the second is the making and unmaking of kings. At Naqsh-i-Rustam, located here in the map, right alongside Persepolis, the early Iranian rulers juxtaposed their images with Achaemenid tombs as part of their appropriation of ancient monuments identified as the detritus of the mythical forerunners of the Iranian court. The second Iranian ruler, Shapur I, who reigns between 240 and 270 CE, had the Achaemenid monument known as the Kaaba of Zoroaster inscribed with an account of his military campaigns and the composition of his court. Shapur's inscription marked a military campaign of staggering success. In 260, Iranian forces traversed Roman Mesopotamia and Syria and conquered Antioch, the greatest urban center of the Roman Middle East. By the court's own account, the aim of the campaigns was to subordinate Rome to Iran, to define the nature of Iranian imperial rule in terms of its relationship with its competitor for the claim to universal empire. In a contemporary rock relief that overlooks the inscription, Shapur appears subjugating the Roman Emperor Valerian in 260 as a symbol of the supremacy of the kings of kings over the so-called Caesars, the Khazar in Middle Persian. The taking of Roman cities resulted in the Roman payment of tribute, patent signs of tributary status, and what was emerging in late antiquity as a pan-Eurasian grammar of sovereignty. For the early Iranian court, the exaction of tribute was a matter of some urgency, for the claim to rule Iranshahr implied a claim to universal sovereignty. The territory of the Iranians in the Avesta, so according to these myths that are being appropriated, resided at the center of the world, and the ruler of Iranshahr was to subjugate all surrounding rulers, something that was practically, politically not possible, but that is through the collection of tribute and the conduct of campaigns such as this, symbolically possible. And to the course of these campaigns and the representation of these campaigns at complexes such as Naqsh-i-Rustam, the court gives plausibility to the idea of the Iranians as collective universal sovereigns. The process of the military campaign also concretizes a hitherto only imagined class. These campaigns entail nothing more and nothing less than the convention of aristocratic cavalrymen, together with their dependents, on their heavily armored horses, the so-called cataphracts, for a single season, usually in the summertime. And this is something I've called elsewhere recreational warfare. The conduct of a campaign, when the weather's nice, you go out, you attack a few poorly defended Roman cities, come back with some nice works of art, and some deportees that will work your land for you, some laborers, and then you go home and you enjoy your family life. Before the 5th century, Iranian armies rarely remained assembled for longer than a season, and warriors returned to their patrimonies and to their families at its close. And when they didn't, they complained loudly. Not returning to your home and your patrimonial state at the end of the season was a real hurdle for kings of kings when trying to conduct warfare for more than a few months at a time. The early Iranian court here adopts this traditional Parthian institution of the military campaign while transforming its significance. In marching westward into Roman territory, aristocrats are not merely containing the expansionist ambitions of their Roman rival, seeking plunder, or enhancing their human capital in the form of deportations. They're also performing the role of these mythical Iran, these universal sovereigns, establishing the cosmically apposite relationship between powers. The intensity and intimacy of the military campaign had unique potential for forming intersubjective relations between aristocrats who will have resided hundreds, if not thousands, of kilometers away from one another. And again, I have to emphasize the absence of a unifying sea, such as the Mediterranean, in Iranian political culture. By recasting the seasonal campaign as an Iranian campaign, the reenactment of the battles of mythical kings and warriors, the early court rendered the waging of war a vehicle for the creation of mythologized subjectivities, for persuading aristocrats to conceive of themselves as sharing an origin and a destiny with the already self-proclaimed Iranian kings of kings. And such a monumental inscription gives permanency to these fleeting performances. The inscription to be recited at Naqsh Rustam makes a collective memory out of a moment, a memory that defined the origins, functions, and institutions that the inchoate community was to share. It announced the rulership of the kings of kings over the Iranians and the non-Iranians, the so-called on-Iran, enumerates the lands incorporated within their territory, and narrates in exact detail the aggression and deceit of the Romans that resulted in their definitive subjugation. It records the foundation of fire temples and the corresponding patronage for the Zoroastrian priestly elite, and that will be my theme of the next two lectures, and proceeds to list the leading Iranians, including representatives of the great Parthian houses, whose souls were to benefit from the conduct of temple rites. The inscription related these matters to participants in the campaign of 260 at its inception, but also to future generations, amid reliefs and ruins represented as what remained of an original Iranian Avestan polity that they had recreated. And in the final lecture of the series, I'll turn back to the space of Naqsh Rustam and talk about festive, commemorative celebrations taking place within precincts, such as the complex at Naqsh Rustam, where it's very likely that Farvardigan, the annual celebration of the ancestors that takes place immediately preceding the New Year holiday, Nowruz, is supposed to have been celebrated. Roughly 3 decades later, the Iranians convened at another monumental tower, one designed to evoke Achaemenid architecture. At Paikuli in northern Mesopotamia, the court, which you can see here, the court of the 5th king of kings, Narseh, constructs another monument, another tower, together with an inscription commemorating the resolution of a contested succession in 293. Paikuli stood at the confluence of trans-regional routes from southern Mesopotamia to the north and from the Iranian highlands into northern Mesopotamia. So this is the precise route along which cavalrymen on military campaigns from different parts of the empire would take toward Roman territory. So it's a site of convergence of different components of the Iranian field armies. The inscription recorded the circumstances of a disputed succession, a conflict among rival groups of aristocrats and their respective claimants to the throne, the victory of one faction in favor of the King of Kings Narseh, and the convention of an aristocratic community that acclaims him King of Kings. The early Iranian court provided no norms for succession, apart from the principle that only a direct descendant of Ardashir could assume the throne. And the 4 successions that had taken place in 240, 271, 273, and 276 proceeded without unleashing the violence of inter-aristocratic conflict, as takes place in 293. So this is the first episode after the foundation of the empire where we have a large kind of trans-territorial military conflict among different aristocratic groups to determine who shall rule. The inscription makes plain that different aristocratic groupings really drive these conflicts. And Narseh attributes the initiative to bring him to the throne to what he calls groups of Persians and Parthians, Pahlavan and Parsan, who send messengers to him in Armenia requesting that he come and counter a rival claimant. The reason I'm highlighting these lines is the significance that Narseh gives to the agency of an aristocratic community. He only claims to have the right to pursue the throne after he has already been invited to do so by one group of aristocrats. So the pursuit of the throne comes not from him, but from members of the aristocratic community. And I can comment later on this division between Persians and Parthians. These are identities that the Iranian identity is supposed to subsume, not erase. Right? So you can maintain having a regional identity as a Parthian or a Persian while becoming Iranian, which is why I think it's one of the reasons I think it's so important not to confuse these terms within this historical context or arguably within any. These lines provide unparalleled insight into the evolving coalitions that underpinned claims of a particular Sasanian to the throne and reveal what's at stake in dynastic transitions. The empowering of particular aristocrats and their houses at the expense of others in what was a fierce competition among elites to ascend the ranks. So far, pretty banal, right? Aristocratic competition happens in virtually any political context. But what's more interesting here, to me, is this is not a zero-sum game. Political order in the inscription depends on the ongoing integration of aristocratic houses, great and small, even if their respective positions relative to one another could vary widely. All aristocrats who are party to this conflict are restored to positions of power. It's a question of their relative position in the hierarchy. So this is what I mean when I say it's not a zero-sum game. Right? It's not as if those on the losing side are deprived of their positions, of their patrimonies, and of their authorities. They are reinstated. And the aristocratic community reunifies to declare Narseh a ruler. The death of a king presented an opportunity to militarily renegotiate one's position without undermining the normative framework according to which a member of the house of Sasan should rule. Paikuli here monumentalizes the reconvention of the Iranian aristocracy as a ruling class united in its commitment to the royal house. The enthroning of a ruler was an occasion in time and space, alongside the military campaign, to assemble as a collective and to act in unison. The inscription established norms for the procedure to select a king of kings, in which the aristocracy as a collective, transcending its sectional interests, plays the determinative role. Narseh repeats on numerous occasions the importance of this invitation and restates this invitation from the so-called Persians and Parthians. We, the landholders and princes, the grandees and the nobles, the Persians and Parthians, since the God give glory and rulership to the family of Sasan, you, Narseh, ascend your throne and receive the honors of your fathers and ancestors. This acclamation includes not just Narseh's supporters, but also his former enemies. Again, this reunification of a fractured aristocratic class around the new ruler. In this moment, precisely in this moment, the term Iran Shah is reliably invoked. In this moment, when diverse aristocrats act collaboratively to declare a new king of kings, they act in the name of Iran Shah. They invoke this Iranian identity, this Iranian idea, right? This is not, so to speak, a label that is going to be used or a term that is going to be invoked at all times in all places, right? It designates a very specific sphere of action, right? And it designates the making and unmaking of kings as a characteristically Iranian act. The term Iran Shah recurs no less than 25 times in the inscription, with very specific contexts. The extended description of the process of acclamation underscored the dependency of the King of Kings on the assent of the aristocracy. These assembled aristocrats, they invite him to take the throne, quote, as the most righteous, the rashtar of the available members of the royal house. And Narseh, in turn, requests their confirmation that there is no one more righteous than him. Now, what this leaves open, and the use of these comparatives leaves open the idea that it was possible for there to be another Sasanian who was more righteous, and who therefore could be installed on the throne in his place. This language explicitly recognizes something that we have elaborated in texts written a couple centuries later, that aristocrats also have the privilege of unmaking a king, of removing a Sasanian from the throne, if he does not act according to their expectations. The sovereign power of the autocrat depends on the support of the, quote, Iranian community, here explicitly divided into Persian and Parthian aristocratic houses. And these are communities riven by internal conflicts, despite their coordinated action within a particular context. And such support could be withdrawn almost as quickly as it was conferred. And the Paikali inscription provides the first formal statement of a fundamental norm in Iranian political culture: the aristocratic privilege of organizing rebellions against kings deemed unjust, who had lost the khfara, the cosmically vital power that suffused the bodies of legitimate Zoroastrian rulers. There can be no clearer statement that sovereignty here is invested in the Iranian community, in the community of aristocrats and kings, not merely in the person of the King of Kings. And this here marks the really important political transformation that the Iranian discourse makes possible. By way of conclusion, I'd like to venture an answer to the question I posed: who were the Iranians? And this was, I would emphasize, a question 3rd century aristocrats in spaces such as the complex at Naqsh-e-Rustam, of which you have now a somewhat fuller view, will also have been asking themselves after the introduction of the discourse in 224 CE. Right? When Ardashir's court places this term on the coinage, it seems most likely to me the vast majority of persons who handled that coinage would have had very little idea what this term meant, and certainly what it was supposed to mean to them. By 293, they had become intimately familiar with the terms of an Iranian identity and the privileges to which membership within this novel imagined community entitled them. They understood that to call themselves Iranian was to claim shared ancestry within a genealogical community reaching back to the original Arya of the Avesta. What we do not know is whether in the 3rd century aristocrats actually called themselves Iranian, as their successors would do in the 4th and 5th centuries. But whether these so-called great men, Vuzurgan, imagined themselves as Iranian or defined themselves explicitly as such is less important than their participation in a framework, acting as if they were Iranian. For the inscriptions defined the 2 most fundamental political practices and privileges as Iranian. That is, king-making and unmaking, and the command of a military campaign. I use the term framework intentionally to emphasize the mechanics of political identity, in place of the view of identity as a matter of internal self-reflection or consciousness, which is so prevalent in a lot of the contemporary literature. The question I've answered today could well be put somewhat differently. What did being Iranian allow one to do? What could you do with this word, this discourse? Only an Iranian could command military campaigns or make and unmake kings. And within these most important political spaces, the Iranian discourse enabled aristocrats and rulers to present themselves as working in cooperation, in partnership, even when at their most antagonistic and competitive with one another. It was this reorganization of the relationship between imperial court and its aristocratic communities that made the Iranian framework so effective at maintaining the unprecedented political integration of the Middle East over 4 centuries. The court invented Iranians in 224 CE, to evoke a famous book title by Trevor Roper. It produced an invention in another sense, a mechanical device, a contraption that locked aristocratic communities into a cooperative relationship that transcended even their conflicts, a vision of community in which all Iranians exercise power as a collective. The empire, after all, was theirs, Iran Shah, the territory of the Iranians. Right? It does what it says on the tin, so to speak. the empire is no longer the dynastic possession of kings alone. And as I'll elaborate over the next 2 lectures, the Zoroastrian foundations of the Iranian identity included a juridical tradition that, developing and evolving over the next couple of centuries, would guarantee the empire remained theirs in perpetuity as long as Iran endured. And my next topic for November 2nd will be the reproductive politics of the Iranian court, as the court develops institutions to guarantee the biological reproduction of the dynastic houses that together comprised this Iranian community. Thank you for your attention and your patience I feel that jet lag has me fumbling a little bit here today, so thank you for your patience and your attention.